The broad thesis is that America, in stark contrast to the British in their heyday, we tend, for interesting reasons I can go into, to think in terms of grand ideological divides, capitalism versus communism, or then that was followed by democracy versus authoritarianism, and then, terrorism versus freedom or something. And as a result, kind of blinded by these ideological prisms, we are spectacularly blind to the group identities that matter most to people on the ground in the countries where we're trying to help. And often those identities are not national, but ethnic, religious, regional, sectarian. And I show that this blindness to the power of this tribal identity or ethnic identity has led really to some of our greatest foreign policy debacles in the last 50 years, from Vietnam to Afghanistan to Iraq. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we romanticize democracy. We, and again, there are historical reasons for that. It's been a very stable system for most of our history. But we tend to think of democracy as almost like a panacea, even for group conflict and group division. So the idea is, maybe there are these ethnic and tribal divides, but if we just have elections, they will melt away. There'll be ethnic alliances, etc. So we really didn't pay enough attention to the schism between the Sunnis and Shias and Kurds. In Afghanistan, I can talk more about, we thought of the Taliban as really just a fundamentalist movement, when in fact it's also very much a ethnic movement. It was founded and established and largely populated by the Pashtuns, the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan. And a lot of the development of the Taliban they were afraid of losing their dominance in that country. So what happened is, how the book came to be in its current form is last February, a month after President Trump took office, I was teaching a class that I've taught for 20 years called International Business Transactions. It's actually not just about business. I use it to talk about democracy and all this stuff that I'm interested in. And I was making a point that I've made for 20 years, citing World on Fire, saying, talking about how because developing countries have political and social dynamics that are so different from our own, we always mess up our foreign policy. We just don't understand those other developing countries. So I'm reading a passage from World on Fire saying in developing countries, under certain conditions, populist leaders with no political experience can sweep to power to the horror of the establishment, tapping into deep social resentments and racially tinged anxiety. And I stopped, and 80 people are looking at me and all thinking the same thing, which one student articulated. She said, "It sounds exactly like you're describing the United States." And I had been reading a passage about Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. So it was really this wake-up call for me. I had to kind of rethink things, why it is. So that's kind of a big part of the book now, that we in the United States, for the first time in our history, and we can talk more about this, are starting to display some of the dynamics destructive political dynamics that historically have been more associated with non-Western or developing world, and including ethno-nationalist movements, elite backlash against the popular side of democracy, hate-mongering, erosion of trust in our institutions, and so on. And I can explain a little bit later. The book kind of explores why we are starting to see these. And I also think, and this is the last thing I'll say, that starting to see, for me, I think we're also confused. How do we get to this place? How can America look like it does right now? And when you step away and see the United States, this moment as part of a larger global pattern, not just comparing us to the far-right movements in Europe, which is what everybody does, but actually seeing us through the same lens that we review countries like Venezuela or Afghanistan or Iraq that we think have nothing to do with us, I think it actually points the way forward. the way out of this. And I'm an optimist, believe it or not. So I think that's my nutshell.